In this video, we're going to talk about the next routine of SQL PSM, which is the function, which is a routine that returns values and may take parameters. It also must be called explicitly. Now, we've interacted with many functions when we've interacted with the MySQL environment. These include aggregate functions, which include sum, max, min, count, etc., scalar functions such as upper, lower, round, etc., and date functions such as string to date or date diff, etc. Like those functions that we've already used, we can create our own function that can do any kind of calculation or interact with the database in any way to return values that we're interested in. So to create a function in SQL PSM, we follow the same thing with creating any routine. We're going to say delimiter, and then we change the delimiter. In this case, we're going to change it to $$. Then we create the function and give it a name. And then we're going to pass in any parameters. Unlike procedures, we don't need in, out, or in, out. We just pass in the variables that we're interested in as well as their data types. And we can provide as many parameters as we want between the parentheses. Then we're going to indicate what type of data is returned from this function. So we then say returns and then a specific data type. We will then begin our function where we can declare variables, cursors, and constants. And at the end of the begin and end code, we're going to include a return where we're going to return some variable that is going to be of the data type that we previously defined in the returns data type portion. Then we end with our $signs and then reset the delimiter back to semicolon. To specifically call a function, we're going to say select function name and then the variable from dual. So if you remember, if we wanted to use the sum function, we'd say select sum and then the variable from a table. So we can do the same thing when selecting a function that we've created in our database. So let's go over an example. If I asked you to create a function named getPaymentType that returns the payment type for a particular order, what we can do is specify the delimiter and then we can say create function getPaymentType. What we're going to do is pass in the order. So we'll have a variable of vOrderID. This is going to be an integer. Then what we want to return is a varchar 50 representing the payment type that's going to be returned. Then we're going to begin and end our code, and everything between that is going to be executed when we call this function. So one of the first things we're going to do is declare a variable. So we're going to set @paymentType equal to null, and then we'll select distinct description. This is going to give me the payment type description into the variable we previously defined called @paymentType. So this is a new keyword of into where we're going to take the values that are returned in our select statement and store it into a variable that we previously created. We're going to join payment to payment type on payment type ID, and then we're going to look for only the order that has been passed in by saying where the order ID equals the variable order ID that's been passed in. And then finally, we're going to return the @paymentType, which is the variable we've created and stored the payment description inside of. In order to call this function, we're going to show only orders with payments. So we're going to select order ID and then get payment type of order ID. So this is going to return all the payment types. So we'll give it an alias of payment type. We're going to pull this from the order table. We'll then group by the order ID, and then we're only going to return where the records where the payment type is not null, and then we'll order by order ID. So here I am back at the server. I've gone ahead and copied these queries over. I'm going to go ahead and run this first one, and it says the function was successfully created. Let's go to the procedures and functions tab, and we can see that getPaymentType is now included as an object that is a function. Just like procedures, if I click on this, I can see what the code was to create this function. All right, so now what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and run this query to call this new function. And so it shows all the order IDs. It then passes the order ID through to get the payment type, and that's exactly what we see here. We're filtering out those that are null, and then we're going to order by order ID, as you can see here. So we can see that all of these orders have received payments that are of the type of deposit. All right, so here's another learning activity. So try these two queries on your own, pause this video, and then come back to compare your answers. Welcome back. I've gone ahead and copied these two queries over and commented them out. So let's go ahead and answer this first one, which asks us to create a function named getOutstandingBalance, which returns the balance remaining on a given order. Select from this function only those orders with an outstanding balance. So what we can see here is that we want to return a balance, so that's going to be a double, and then we want it for a specific order. So that's going to be what we're passing in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and widen this. And we'll go ahead and begin by changing the delimiter to $$, and then we'll change it back to a semicolon, and then we'll create the function. We'll name it getOutstandingBalance, and then what I'm going to pass in is a given order, so we'll use vOrderID as an integer, and then what I'm going to return is a balance, so returns a double. We'll do 10 2, and then I'll go ahead and begin my function and end it with $$, and between here I'm going to put the code. So this code, I'm going to return an outstanding balance, so let's go ahead ahead and create a variable by saying set at balance equal to null, and then I want to return this balance, so I'm going to say return at balance. Alright, so the next thing that I'm going to do is write the query that is going to get the outstanding balance. So this is going to be the sum of the price times the quantity minus the sum of all the payments for a particular order. So I'm going to say select sum of price times quantity, and then we'll subtract, and then I'm going to use a subquery here and say select sum of payments, which is the amount column. So this is going to come from the payment table where the order ID is equal to the v order ID, so the order ID that is passed into this function. And then this column I'm going to store into the variable that I created of at balance. Alright, to finish this query, we need to join the table that has price and the table that has quantity together, and so this is the product table and the order line table. So I'm going to say from product p inner join order line ol on p.productID equals ol.productID. So the next thing that I'm interested in is only the orders that are passed in. So I'm going to say where order ID is equal to the order ID that is passed in, so v order ID. Then I'm going to group by the order ID. And then what I'm going to do is check where the sum of the price times the quantity is greater than the sum of all the amounts. So let's go ahead and copy this. I'm going to say having, and we'll paste this and change this to greater than. So now we have the sum of the price times the quantity, and we're going to check to see if that is greater than all the payments that have been received, and that should be our query. So I'll go ahead and run this query. It says the function was successfully created. So now we're going to go ahead and select from it. So we'll say select, and let's show the order ID, and then we'll get outstanding balance, and we'll pass in the order ID, and this will come from the order table, and we need to put that in tick marks because it's a reserved keyword. I'll go ahead and run this, and we can see that we get 58 rows that were returned. Now we have a bunch of null values. Okay, so now we need to get rid of all the null values. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this again, and I'm going to say where this is not null. I'll go ahead and run it, and we see only those orders that have remaining balances. I could give this an alias as remaining balance and run it, and now we see the remaining balance for each of these orders. Alright, this next query asks us to create a function named getMaterialsRequired that will return the total materials required for each product. And then we're supposed to select from this function shown the description and materials required for all products. So let's go to our entity relationship diagram, and we see that there is a quantity required of a product inside the product material. So we're going to be dealing with product material. So to start, let's specify the delimiter as $, and then we'll go ahead and reset the delimiter to semicolon. We're going to then create the function, and we'll name it getMaterialsRequired. Alright, what I'm going to pass in is the product, and then I'm going to return the total materials. So let's go ahead and define a variable of vProductID, and this is going to be the parameter I pass in. It's going to be an integer. And then what this returns is an integer as well of total materials. So the next thing that we're going to do is begin and end our function, and then what we're going to return is the total materials. So let's go ahead and set that variable. So we'll say set at quantity equal to null, and then we're going to return at quantity. So now we need to get the total number of materials, so let's go ahead and select the sum of the quantity required from product material, and then we want it for a specific product, so we're going to join product material to product, and what's common across these two is the product ID. So we'll give this an alias of PM, we'll inner join this to product, we'll give this an alias of P, and then we'll say on pm.productID equals p.productID. And then we're only interested in the product that's passed in, so we'll say where p.productID equals vProductID. Before we create this function, we're going to need to store the sum of the quantity required into our new variable. So we're going to say into at quantity. We'll go ahead and run this function. It says that it successfully was created. Now we're asked to show the description, so I'm going to select the description and the total number of materials. So we're going to get the materials required, and then we're going to pass in the product ID, and this is from the product table. We'll go ahead and give this column an alias of as quantity, and let's go ahead and run this query, and we can see for each product we can see the total number of materials that were included in this product.